Welcome to the Plant-Centered and Thriving Podcast. I'm your host, Ashley Kitchens. Welcome to the show. My name is Ashley, and I'm so glad you're here today. Part of the reason is because we're talking about a little bit of a controversial topic, and I feel like you can already guess what that probably is. Dun, dun, dun. We're talking about soy. So I have been following Dr. Nagra for a little while on social media, and he had put out this reel on soy. And I was like, I have to have him on the show to talk about soy because there's so much misinformation out there when it comes to soy. And so, who better to talk about it than Dr. Matthew Nagra, who is a naturopathic doctor devoted to bringing the most up to date evidence-based nutrition information to his patients at his clinic in Vancouver and also on social media, which I'm so thankful for. In 2018, he graduated from the Boucher Institute of Naturopathic Medicine after completing his Bachelor's of Science in Microbiology at the University of Victoria. He's certified in plant-based nutrition through eCornell and the T. Colin Campbell's Center for Nutrition Studies. Dr. Nagra is also a public speaker and is known for his content across multiple social media platforms, which he shares all of those with us at the end of our conversation. And we included all of those links below so that if you want to connect with Dr. Nagra, you can do so really, really easily. So on these social media platforms, like I said, he often tackles misinformation around diet and nutrition and deep dives into the latest nutrition research. So I highly recommend following him just because he is a reliable source, especially when it comes to plant-based nutrition information. I don't know about you, but I cannot wait for this conversation. So gear up and let's welcome Dr. Nagra to the show and let's bust some myths when it comes to soy. Welcome to the show, Dr. Nagra.
Thanks for having me.
Thanks for coming on. We are so excited to have you here. We're thrilled to bust some soy myths. It's a pretty controversial topic. I don't know if it really needs to be, but we'll get into that. And before we do, I'm really curious personally, and I know the listener is too, because we love listening to stories and how people transition to plant-based or veganism. So could you kind of just give us a little background on how you got into plant-based eating?
Yeah, when I was younger, I had some health issues. I struggled with weight management. I had asthma. Allergies were quite bad at least in the springtime. Just things like that. And I started working with a personal trainer in my early teens, around 14 or so. And he really pushed more of a plant-based approach. He was actually very much into like raw foods and things like that too, but largely plant-based focused. And I, being so young, didn't really take too much of what he said to heart. But there was a point where he wanted me to record everything that I ate, like a food diary, for a period of a couple of weeks. And I just didn't want him to really see how bad my diet was because it wasn't good. It was a lot of, your sugary cereals, fruit roll-ups, mac and cheese, McDonald's, like all that kind of stuff. And so I thought, you know what, I'm gonna revamp my diet and really impress him with this, healthier diet. So at that point, I cut out the dairy, the milk. Absolutely, a few things with a little bit of dairy might have snuck in here or there, but for the most part, got rid of that. I got rid of all of more the classic kind of junk food, sugar sweetened beverages like sodas and whatnot, potato chips, that kind of thing. And then I ate a lot more plants, having a lot of smoothies. I still had a little bit of meat, but definitely cut down. And I started feeling better. I was losing weight, energy is up, skin was clearing up. And I just thought, well, maybe there's something to this. Maybe there is something there. And I should really learn more and kind of dive deeper on that. And so I stuck with it from then on and just learned more and more over the next even couple of years. And there were periods where I was like strictly plant-based throughout that. And then it was when I went to university and I started, getting into cafeteria food and drinking with my friends on the weekends and that I noticed, my health is kind of sliding back the other way a little bit. I'm maybe not feeling as energetic as I was. And there was a point in my second semester where I just decided, you know what, I'm cutting it. I'm going 100%, and have been ever since.
Nice. So you started this journey before you even started training to become a doctor, it sounds like.
Oh yeah, it was a long time ago. Yeah.
Wow, that's wonderful. So how did that impact your time at university? How was that for you being plant-based and learning all that you did?
Um, It's a lot different than it is nowadays, for sure. I mean, I go back, I hang out with friends in Victoria where I went to school, and there's just so many options everywhere now. Back then, there was one, cafe I would go to downtown. They have, these like vegan desserts and stuff that I'd try out. Actually, one time I got a bunch of friends. I got them all hooked on the vegan desserts, even though they
Yes.
weren't vegan. So we'd go and we ordered like a huge cake one time. I remember that, and we each split it, and that was pretty funny. And just to be clear, I wasn't eating cakes and things like that all the time, but it was the one kind of place to go outside of whatever I was preparing myself. And so I had a Vitamix in my room. Actually, I was very fortunate to have that. I had a little mini fridge in my room that I would stock up with whatever I could, and then at the cafeteria, I just had really limited options. I know they had a salad bar that I would pick from, and they'd have the greens, the veggies, the chickpeas, and whatever, some grains. I think it was quinoa. I can't remember. And I would just load those up and use all my food points or whatever that they were at the time, and
Yep.
just get whatever I could. And that was kind of it. I lived on that sort of a diet for quite a period. And now, like I said, I go back and it's totally different. There's so many more options everywhere, including on campus.
That's wonderful. I mean, that's so encouraging that there are just more options available
Mhm.
to people who are plant-based or vegan or vegetarian. Because yeah, when I went to school for a decade ago, there were no options. So
Yeah.
yeah. Yep, understandable. Well, great. So let's dive right into soy. But before we even get into the details and bust some myths and everything, what can you kind of just define like what soy is, or where does it come from, or how do we consume it as consumers?
Yeah, I mean, soy is literally just a bean. I don't know why everyone gets so rustled about it. It's just a bean. It's been consumed in especially Asian cultures for thousands of years at this point, very long time, and it's used in a whole host of ways, right? We have soy sauce, obviously that's pretty common. We have tofu, tempeh. You have whole soybeans in the form of, say, edamame. You have soy milk. You have soy curls, which I'm just in love with. Textured vegetable protein, or soy chunks, sometimes they're called, which are little kind of meaty substitutes, very much like the soy curls. There's a lot of different uses for it. And then we also have the soybean oil that tends to be used a lot in more processed foods. It's very common in that sort of food. So yeah, it's used everywhere in a variety of ways, and depending on how you consume it, like if you're consuming it in the form of ultra processed foods on a regular basis, yeah, not going to be so good for you. But obviously, we're going to be talking more about when you're having the tofu or the edamame or the soy milk and so on.
Yep. More of like the whole food sources and more of probably what is used in studies when like a lot of these studies that have been going on for decades, or like you said, soy has been around for such a long time.
Hmm.
It's also been heavily researched for a long time,
Yeah.
which is wonderful. And I like Dr. Nagra that you said soy is literally just a bean. Like that's what it
Yeah.
is. It's not this like magical or detrimental thing that we're putting into our body, which speaking of, there's this kind of question of like, well, does soy have estrogen in it? I think there's a lot of
Mhm.
misconception out there of like, what, where's the fear coming from and the misinformation coming from? So I guess could you just clear that up? Like, does soy
Yeah.
have estrogen?
Yeah. So soy, like I said, it is just a bean. It actually does have some unique properties, though. And one of those properties is the concentration of what are called phytoestrogens. That's one word for it. I almost wish it was a different name just because people get so confused by it. I mean, you can call them isoflavones, or you can break them down into the individual types of isoflavones, which are just flavonoids. They're compounds that are in a lot of foods. There's this idea that because it has a similar structure to estrogens, that it's going to cause an estrogenic response in our body. And they do actually bind to some of the same receptors in our body that estrogen does, but they don't act the same way. So we have estrogen receptors, we have different types of estrogen receptors. And when these isoflavones bind to them, they actually bind much weaker and have much less of an effect on them compared to our own estrogen, the estrogen that our bodies produce. So strength wise, you're looking at about 1/100th to 1/1000th of strength. So they're very weak in that sense. Now, what's interesting is because they prefer to bind to certain receptors, specifically estrogen receptor beta is what it's called. I typically call them beta receptors. It's just a little easier. Those receptors can have anti-estrogenic effects in breast tissue, which is a good thing. Too much estrogen in breast tissue can promote breast cancer. So having an anti-estrogenic effect can actually reduce risk of breast cancer. And I'm sure we'll get to that in a little bit. But then having, say, pro-estrogenic response in bone tissue, where you want estrogen, right? That actually helps maintain bone mineral density, which is really important, especially for women as they age. So it just doesn't act the same way. And a lot of the concerns just come from that name, the name of the phytoestrogen. And in part from, studies on rodents where they feed them just absurd amounts of these isolated phytoestrogens, and they might have negative effects from that. Or there are a couple case studies of some men who are consuming off the top of my head, I think it was somewhere in the ballpark of like 12 to 20 servings of soy a day, and potentially ran into issues with that. But we also have multiple meta-analyses now looking at either men or women consuming varying amounts of soy, where these are randomized controlled trials, so people are fed either soy products or something else for comparison, and you actually don't see a significant impact on, say, testosterone or estrogen levels in either men or women. So we have actually really solid research suggesting that no, it doesn't have this crazy impact on your sex hormone levels, while actually a lot of those concerns coming from very, very, very low quality research.
Yes. I like that you said that. I wish it wasn't labeled like a phytoestrogen, because I agree with that. I feel like there's just a lot of confusion, and
Yeah.
obviously those words are very similar. So it creates a lot of confusion. So you're saying that even a positive estrogenic effect isn't necessarily a bad thing. Like, it sounds like there's some
Oh,
positives that come from it, and it can be a really weak effect as well.
yeah, absolutely. And you think about, women in menopause, they often go on, estrogen therapy. Well, there's actually some research on these isoflavones and using them in that sort of or isoflavones, phytoestrogens. I'm going to use those interchangeably for anyone listening. I probably will throughout this. There's some research on those actually being supplemented and improving certain menopausal symptoms as well. So it can have beneficial effects for sure. It's not necessarily harmful. And in fact, the research we have suggests that it is predominantly beneficial.
Yeah, definitely. So and you kind of mentioned this, soy has been around for such a long period of time. We have people, cultures all around the world who've been consuming it for, like you said, over 1,000 years. So how did it, even more recently, and I would say in the past century, in the past few decades, how did it become controversial, or where did that kind of start, or what are some things that happened that maybe blew up in the media?
I mean, well, one of them is that estrogen, phytoestrogen, the terminology there for sure. A part of it is, well, it's in everything. It's in a lot of processed foods too. And it's the same thing we see with a lot of oils, right? Soybean oil being one of them, that, oh, because these foods as a whole have a negative impact on your health, or can have a negative impact on your health, therefore the individual components do too. But to really push back on that, I always say, well, the main ingredient in Coca-Cola is water. Does that mean water is bad for you? No, of course not. So we have to look at research on the individual components and seeing, what sort of effect does this have? For all we know, it could actually be worse if you took the same processed foods but put butter in instead, right? So that's a part of it. There's certainly a lot of skepticism around GMOs and things like that. But funny thing is, most of most of the soy meant for human consumption isn't GMO anyway. That's mostly what we're feeding off to, or at least directly for human consumption. It's mostly what we're feeding to animals, or potentially using in processed foods. In fact, I don't know that I can find any products here like tofu and whatnot that aren't labeled non-GMO. And even then, not convinced it's a concern. So,
Yeah.
so like, either way, it doesn't really matter. But if one had that concern, it just doesn't seem like it's even a valid concern, because it's not really in anything. I think there's a variety of ways that this is happening, and I wouldn't be surprised if a part of it is a lot of meat industry pushing concerns. Like, I've looked at certain website, Weston A. Price, for example. Not that they're necessarily meat industry, but they definitely promote that consumption pattern. A lot of their references around soy are like, quite frankly, hilarious when you look at it. It's just the title will say, "Oh, it causes heart defects or something," and then you look at the study and it's like in rodents fed, again, absurd amounts of isoflavones. It's really almost dishonest in the way that it's presented.
And I appreciate you highlighting that, because there are so many nutrition studies coming out every single day, like 100, over 100,000 a year. And so to also know and recognize where your information is coming from, who is giving you this information, and maybe what studies they're using is always helpful as well, because you just never know the quality of the study, or if they are just nitpicking single ingredients and
Mhm.
maybe adapting the study to fit what they want to talk about, that type of thing.
Yeah, you can find a study to support anything. I could throw some studies at you right now showing that smoking doesn't cause lung cancer. You know what I mean? Like it's not that hard to find. It's just you have to look at the totality of the evidence, the highest quality research. What does that point to? Is it consistent? Do you see it in a variety of populations? When you're seeing all of these different studies that are conducted in a certain way in varying populations with varying levels of intake and whatnot, all pointing in the same direction, you can be pretty confident that that's the right conclusion.
Yep. Yep. Absolutely. All right. So let's get into these 4 common soy myths and let's bust them. So the first one, which you touched on just a little bit, is that soy causes breast cancer. Maybe it increases your risk for breast cancer.
Yeah, so I already touched on the whole estrogen kind of confusion there, and how it can actually have anti-estrogenic effects in breast tissue. Well, the funny thing is when we look at research, especially in Asian populations, on soy consumption and risk of breast cancer, you actually see higher soy consumption associated with a lower risk of developing breast cancer. Now, we don't see that as often in Western populations, but just to throw a question at you, do you know why?
I would imagine it has to do with the way that we consume soy or just our diet in
So
general.
that's usually what people think, and that might play into it a little bit, but it's actually not the main one. It's the amount. When we're
Oh,
comparing high versus low consumption in Asian populations, you're typically looking at like daily versus like once a week or something. Right? It's a pretty big range.
yeah.
In Western populations, when you're looking at soy consumption, it's like once a week versus once a month. And having soy once a week isn't going to do much for your breast cancer risk.
Yeah.
And so, that's one of the key things to look at with any nutrition research, whether you're looking at red meat and cardiovascular disease, you're looking at soy and breast cancer, is did this study actually capture a wide variety of intakes? Even with red meat, if you look at Asian populations, you're often comparing like 2 servings a week versus like 1 serving a month or something, whereas red meat is typically harmful when it's a daily thing, when you're having a full serving a day kind of thing. And so it's the same type of thing here. So that's the main reason. There are potentially reasons to the way that we consume it, potentially some speculation around some of the gut microbes that we have and the way that you break down soy could be different between populations. And but at the end of the day, those likely have smaller impacts than the overall contrast in the level of intake. So that would be it. And then I'll add on top of just the risk of developing breast cancer, we actually have research on breast cancer survivors or people who have been diagnosed with breast cancer. And you actually see higher survival rates in the people who consume more soy. So even amongst people with breast cancer, while we don't have a ton of research, the research we do have suggests that it's actually beneficial for them to be eating more soy as well.
Ah, fascinating. So really, when we're looking at the population in the US, like you said, a big difference is like how often we consume soy versus maybe some of these other populations who have lower rates of breast cancer or who are living longer.
Exactly. And they just, like I said, they consume it very regularly and we don't. So
Yeah. Yep. Yeah, it's true. Probably because we're scared to consume it. No, I know
yeah,
that's part of it, but
that's probably a part of it. And a
yeah.
part of it's cultural. It's just not been a part of our diets.
Yes, absolutely. I know. I remember seeing tofu. This was like a decade ago at a buffet, and I was like, "Who would eat that?" It
Yeah.
was just like it looked like the most unappetizing thing, and now I just can't get enough of it. So I can definitely
Yeah.
see that. Yep. All right, so let's go into myth number 2, in that soy causes men's breasts to grow.
So this is something that I kind of already touched on too. This idea that men can grow breasts, actually that specifically comes from one case study on a guy who was again consuming a ridiculous amount of soy, and they found that he was developing some breast tissue, got rid of the soy, and it decreased. But this is a ridiculous amount that he was eating. When we look at again research on randomized controlled trials, we have a meta-analysis of randomized controlled trials. I think it was 43 randomized controlled trials. I could be a little off on that. It might actually be a little bit higher, somewhere in that ballpark, published in 2020. And you actually see that there isn't significant impact on testosterone or estrogen levels, with whether you're looking at higher soy consumption or lower soy consumption, measured as the amount of phytoestrogens they were taking in. So I don't see any reason to be concerned about that. There is simply no good data to suggest that that is something that would occur. And in fact, the best available research that we have suggests that it isn't something that occurs.
And unfortunately, a lot of where we get our information, our data is social media. So when you have one story, like the
Hmm.
person that you're talking about, which blew up, on, I don't know if social media was really that popular back then, but like just
Yeah.
on the media in general, that spread like wildfire, and also created a lot of fear or concern that maybe it could happen to, my brother or my dad or someone like that.
Yeah, no, it's something that I kind of wrestle with almost daily or at least weekly in my clinic with patients that come in. They've heard certain things, and we end up breaking down the whole soy topic because it's just so common.
Yes. Yeah, absolutely. Okay. So let's jump into myth number 3, which you've touched on a little bit, Dr. Nagra, but soy, does it affect our hormone levels? And you can kind of touch on, which hormones specifically.
Yeah, so with most testosterone, with estrogen levels, whether men or women, there's not a clinically relevant effect from every bit of the at least higher quality research we've seen, the meta-analyses on randomized controlled trials. There just really isn't. Now, I think if I look at the questions here, one of the hormones you listed was thyroid, and I think that's a kind of a good stepping off point here because we've kind of covered the other ones already. With thyroid health, now this is interesting. So soy is one of the foods, and there are a variety of them, like broccoli and that family of vegetables can also do this. They can interfere with iodine uptake in the thyroid, and they can actually cause a goiter. So it can cause hypothyroidism and kind of growth of a lump there in the throat. Well, we first saw that with soy back in, I think it was the 50s or 60s, where they were using soy-based formulas for infants who maybe couldn't have cow's milk formula, and they were developing goiter. Well, the issue was they weren't getting any iodine. There wasn't iodine in the soy formula at the time. Now, iodine is found in dairy products, but what most people don't actually know is it's not inherent to dairy products. It's actually because they clean the udders with iodine. And so it kind of gets in the
Really?
milk that way. Yeah.
I didn't know
Yeah. So,
that.
yeah. That's at least my understanding of where
Yeah.
it mostly comes from. But with soy, so since that time, they found that, okay, well, when these infants develop goiter and then you give them iodine, you can actually reverse it. And so now they fortify soy milk or soy formulas. And I wish they would do soy milks. Most plant milks actually aren't fortified with iodine. I wish they would, but soy formulas anyway are fortified with iodine to prevent that issue. So when we look at, say, adults and soy consumption, sure, if your iodine intake is very low, you could run into issues, but just make sure your iodine intake is adequate. And the main source of iodine in most people's diet is going to be iodized salt. So salt is typically iodized, unless you're choosing, say, Himalayan salt or other sea salt or whatever, then it doesn't have added iodine. So I'm fully an advocate for iodized versions of salt, or of course, supplement is a reasonable option in its place. So that would be, I think, covering most of the thyroid issues. Oh, and actually, for people with hypothyroidism who might be taking medications for it, super important to separate the medication from when you're consuming soy, or really a lot of other foods too. So a lot of doctors will recommend having it on an empty stomach, and definitely speak with your doctor if you are changing your diet or taking any medications like that, just to make sure they're in the loop. But that, I think, covers the thyroid topic pretty well.
Yeah, I appreciate you kind of going into detail there, because I think it sounds like it's almost like there's something else going on. It's not just the soy that's an issue. It's maybe there's a lack of another nutrient like iodine in your diet, or maybe you already have a thyroid issue or concern where you just need to be a bit more careful or cautious with
Mhm.
your soy consumption, or how you're consuming soy, or when, I
Yeah,
guess.
yeah, exactly.
Yeah. Okay. Great. So, last but not least, myth number 4, soy should be consumed in limited quantities. And the reason I asked this, Dr. Nagra, is I heard another influencer talk about how soy should only be consumed maybe once a month, once a week
Oh,
at
wow.
max. And I was in an uproar. I did not say anything, but yes. So, could you kind of clarify that for us?
I was just thinking of how I probably would have said something.
Yeah.
But, yeah, but anyways, yeah, so soy is, like, there just isn't a good reason to be concerned about it up to, you know, any reasonable amount of 5 servings a day, 6, or like, I just don't see any real concern for that. I would say even well beyond that. Now, if someone wants to be extra cautious, okay, that's fine. I don't see most people going above 4 or 5 servings a day anyway, simply because then you're crowding out other things, right? That's the concern. If you're eating so much of one food that you're not getting much of other things, you want your nuts and seeds, you want your vegetables, you want your fruits, whole grains, you want to have that good mix. Um, then otherwise I just wouldn't be concerned about it. I just don't see any good research pointing to concerns unless like all of your protein is coming from soy. And actually, speaking of protein, I should throw in that soy is actually a very high quality protein source. It's been pitted directly against whey protein, which is considered like the highest quality. And you have similar outcomes for muscle and strength gains. As far as nutritional value, probably number one amongst the legumes. Like it's a powerhouse food, and it's not something to really shy away from, of course, unless you have an allergy or something.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. Yes, it is a powerhouse food for everyone listening. It is a great source of protein, and it's a very nutrient dense food. And like Dr. Nagra said, it's a bean. It's not something that we
Yeah.
really need to be scared of. And I think I really like too that you highlighted the fact that when the reason we don't recommend more than 5, 6, 7, 8 servings of soy is exactly what Dr. Nagra says, because then you're crowding out other foods and your diet becomes pretty limited and you're not getting a whole lot of variety. And we know that variety is really important in any diet. And obviously, we talk a lot about it in a plant-based diet as well.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So to kind of close this down, are there any, and you kind of mentioned this already, but are there types of soy products that you recommend to your clients or your patients, just kind of things that you often go-tos maybe for yourself even?
Um, I mean, I don't know that there's any that I would recommend as just better than. I think it really comes down to personal preference. I mean, for me, I love tofu. I've smoked tofu, regular tofu. I love soy curls. Especially if you want more of a meaty kind of texture. I have soy milk. That's my main milk of choice. Have it every day. Um, and yeah, those are really the three for me that I tend to rely on the most. But other people like love tempeh. I have some friends that absolutely love tempeh, and that's their main one. And no, that's fine too. It's really up to you. I wouldn't really say that one is necessary or far better than the others.
Yes. Yeah. I feel like there are diehard tempeh fans and there are diehard tofu
Yeah,
fans. So
yeah, I'm
yes.
tofu all the way.
Yes. Yeah. Understandable. Well, Dr. Nagra, if someone's looking to connect with you on social media or visit your website, where is the best place that they can do that?
Yeah, so I have a website, drmatthewnagra.com. Also have a newsletter I send out once a month. You can sign up there just for things like this, new podcasts, whatever drops, we throw it in there. And then I've got Instagram. That's where I'm most active. So at Dr. Matthew Nagra, so Dr. Matthew Nagra. Also on Facebook, Twitter, TikTok, doing all sorts of things on all those platforms. So feel free to follow and send a message, ask questions, comment, all of that.
And I highly recommend following Dr. Nagra on social media, on Instagram, especially. That's where I reached out to him and everything, just because you are constantly busting myths and putting out evidence-based nutrition information when it comes to plant-based eating. And I think in this world of we're constantly getting information from various people, it's really helpful to have just go-to sources that we know are providing valuable and evidence-based information, which can be hard to find. So highly recommend it because I love your reels and all that stuff that you put out.
Thank you. That's what I do.
Yeah, you're welcome. Well, thank you again for coming on the show. I really appreciate it. And I really appreciate you sharing your knowledge on soy.
You're welcome. Thanks for having me, and hope people took something from that.
Until next time, keep thriving.